Good morning and welcome everyone to the third edition of the PSE-CEPR Policy Forum, this year devoted to the future of work. It's a pleasure to see you all and I hope we will have three interesting and engaging days on the topics of the forum. Let me use these few introductory remarks to highlight some of the specificities of the forum in terms of format and in terms of substance relative to the typical academic conference that we routinely organize here. Because it's different, the forum is different. The goal of the forum, as initially envisioned by Daniel Cohen and Jean-Olivier Hérault some 4 years ago, was to bring together leading academic researchers and influential policymakers to address the most pressing societal and economic issues of our time. The conviction underlying the forum was that sound and robust policymaking must be rooted in strong intellectual and scientific foundations, and at the same time, social science research, and particularly economics, must absolutely grapple with and address policy challenges. It so happened that the Paris School of Economics, from its very inception, had as one of its chief purpose to bring together this policy making and research. So it was only natural that we would organize and host an event of this type on a regular basis. So the format of the forum has been designed, especially this year, and I'm going to tell you about what the innovations are in this respect, especially this year, to favor these interactions between academic research and policy making. Researchers from PSE and from many other places will have the opportunity to present and to discuss their work. But the forum will also leave ample space for discussion, exchanges, interactions with policymaking in the form of dedicated policy sessions and high-level conversations, policy conversations. So the policy sessions are a novelty of this year, and we will welcome on that occasion representatives of the IMF, of the OECD, and DARES, which is the research department of the French Ministry for Labor. Just as in the previous years, the forum will showcase the next generation of economists by having presentations and poster sessions for advanced PhD students. So we've been doing that very successfully from the first year of the forum. Of course, it has a particular meaning this year, given the topic, because many of these students will be on the job market next year. So they are most chiefly concerned by the topic of the forum this year. In organizing the forum in the way we have, we aim to reach a fairly broad audience, not only the immediate participant in the forum, but more broadly government officials and legislators, students from various institutions and various levels of seniority. We expect in the room at some point some high school students as well. We aim to outreach to the media and to the broader academic community. So this year, overarching theme, the future of work, addresses urgent questions in labor economics, such as how jobs and workplaces are evolving amid environmental and digital transformations, how labor is being reorganized, notably by the rise of remote work, and how gender inequalities in the workplace have been recently playing out. And we will also aim to outline the policy responses able to address those emerging challenges. The PSE-CEPR Policy Forum is organized in partnership with the Center for Economic Policy Research. As many of you know, CEPR is a network of economists, mostly based in Europe, but not only in Europe, whose goal closely align with the objective of the forum. So if I read their motto, the CEPR's objective is to enhance the quality of policy decisions through providing policy-relevant research based soundly in economic theory to policymakers, the private sector, and civil society. So this is exactly what we aim to achieve here. Before we begin, let me thank our admin and communication staff here and also at CEPR for the dedication and the huge amount of work that there is in the background, without which nothing of that would have been possible. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to a productive forum, and I hope you enjoy the discussions ahead. Thank you very much.
Hello, my name is Ariell. I'm a professor at PSC, for those who don't know. I'll be chairing the day. So I have right now the pleasure to introduce Barbara Petrongolo. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Barbara is a leading economist. Her work is specialized in local labor markets, gender economics, and I think more recently also in the interaction of the topic of today, the internet, digitization, and these two topics. She has held positions in London. She spent 3 years here at PSC, and she is now a professor at the University of Oxford. So I think that without further delay, I'll leave the stage to Barbara.
You have 1 hour. So thank you very much for inviting me to this event and for giving this opening, this introduction. So I will try to give some sort of brief overview of main questions and challenges of today's labor markets, and also, in view of introducing the topics of the next 3 days. So let me start with some very broad data, super simple data, some kind of aggregate trends. This is, I'm afraid, just for the US labor market. I could just put this together yesterday on the US labor market. And so let me start with actually some pretty good news. So this is real wages in the US since 1979. So this is the real median wages of full-time employees. So you can see here, this is the sort of stagnation that was going on between the early 1990s and 2015. And this kind of stagnation in real wages is what has attracted a lot of research, for example, on the impacts of technology and polarization, skill bias, technical change. But even before that, you can see that there was pretty sort of long-winded stagnation since the late 1970s, with some growth in the second part of the 1990s. But then starting from 2015, there has been kind of fairly sustained growth in real wages. So this seems to be some reason for good news. Now, how about the composition of that? How about inequality across different types of workers? So this is the next slide that looks at inequality. So there's 2 series here. Again, it's a very crude measure of inequality. So the blue line is the wage differential between college and high school graduates. And again, after this kind of secular increase that took place in the 1980s, it's completely stable. It's been completely stable for more than 20 years at the moment. So inequality at the sort of middle top hasn't been rising. Of course, I'm not saying anything about what was happening at the very top, which is also important. And then inequality in the lower part of the earnings distribution was actually falling. So this is the differential between high school graduates and people without a high school degree. So that kind of differential was narrowing. And then finally, looking at employment population ratios, the red line refers to the prime age workers, 25 to 54. So after the Great Recession dip here and the COVID dip, it seems that the employment population ratio for the prime age is kind of at a similar level to where it was in 2000. But of course, for the sort of overall working age population, 15 to 64, it is now lower. So again, there is quite a bit of a discussion there about Great Resignation, impacts like long-term impacts of the Great Recession, long-term impacts of COVID. And then, of course, there are a lot more interesting questions asking like what's going on within each of these groups. And this is what these 3 days are going to talk about. So this is just a little bit of an introduction. So first day, day one, I mean, what everybody's talking about is what is the future of work holding in there for us in terms of labor market impacts of new technologies. And of course, this brings us to like the main topic of this kind of technology-based discussion about AI and the future of work. Now, whenever we talk about AI, of course, we always hear a mix of excitement and concerns. And this is nothing new, because a mix of excitement and concerns was always characterizing every wave of technological innovation. I mean, we can go back to the power loom or the computer revolution or automation. So, for example, in the case of AI, if we were to build a sort of word cloud of AI and labor markets, you would see words like boosting human knowledge, augmenting expertise, boosting capabilities, but you would also see stuff like work displacement or surveillance or misinformation or manipulation. So where is it that we are going? So how are these kind of hopes and concerns taking shape? Something that we hear kind of often, this time is really different. And in a sense, with a bit of memory going back, this time is different is something that we heard many times with many waves of technological innovation. So probably at the moment we can ask this question again, is this time different or not? So in a way, economists have developed framework for understanding labor market consequences of at least the last half century of technological progress. We have seen skill bias, technical change, we have seen polarization, we have seen automation. And then is it right to ask maybe how well does this toolkit help for understanding the current AI era? Now, the peculiarity about AI is that it can do things that don't simply involve executing instructions and code. AI can learn, can do creative tasks, can solve problems that we didn't formulate, can solve problems that we didn't envisage. So are we at a turning point in technological progress, in the way in which technological progress is shaping the interplay between technology, labor markets, and inequality? So I will touch upon a few questions, and then probably for each question we can argue that there is a lot in common with what we have already seen in the past half a century or even centuries of technological progress, and something that might be new, something that might be completely uncertain. So something that we've seen many times in this discussion about technological progress is that there's winners and losers. So over the course of history, technology has always replaced some tasks and augmented others or created new tasks. So think, for example, of the computer revolution. So similarly with AI, you can diminish or amplify the demand for human expertise. So you can think of routine or quasi-routine tasks in like manufacturing or data-intensive sectors versus intellectual or semi-intellectual tasks in healthcare, finance, consulting, etc. Now, something that might get us worrying a bit more in the case of AI is that, of course, at the moment, the map of winners and losers is to a very large extent, an educated guess. So there is a lot of uncertainty around who exactly in these sectors is winning and losing. And also the speed of adoption is completely unprecedented. So, for example, if you go back to the 1980s, 1990s, and you think about the introduction of the internet, it took about 12 years to reach 1 million users. So 12 years. If you look at like social media platforms like Instagram or Twitter, it took a number of months to reach 1 million users. But with ChatGPT in November 2022, it took only 5 days to reach 1 million users. And the only way I could find this out is, of course, by asking ChatGPT. So in a way, the speed of adoption is completely unprecedented. And then, of course, it's natural to think about worst-case scenarios, not just in the labor market, but also in much broader scenarios. For example, we're thinking about applications of AI that would sort of generate misinformation, manipulation, weakening democracy. So in a sense, the impacts go far beyond the labor market. Now, something that can also be interpreted as common with other waves of technological progress is that there is a central role played by market structure and institution. So typically new technologies improve productivity, but widespread prosperity, or specifically widespread wage gains, do not follow automatically. So this really depends on the way in which the distribution of gains works between labor and capital and between different types of workers. So for example, we have seen several waves of modernization, technology adoption in agriculture, early phases of the Industrial Revolution, in which huge increases in productivity growth, didn't really accrue to the workers. They mostly accrued to the owner of capital, the owners of land. It was only later, with like the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, that more generalized prosperity arrived to workers as well. And this was in part related to the way in which work was organized and the way in which workers could get organized and provide a sort of counterbalancing force to the to the owners of capital. So these kind of questions about the tension in the distribution of AI benefits are kind of similar. They echo quite a bit of what we've seen in the past, in the sense that market structure, property rights, and organization of work would matter a lot for defining who are the winners and who are the losers, or for maximizing the benefits of AI adoption. I mean, this kind of unequal distribution of benefits, for example, between labor and capital, is a legitimate concern if we look, for example, at the way in which very large tech firms dominate technology adoption and would appropriate further advantages. For example, Google, for example, Meta, or OpenAI. And then in the various types of sort of technology adoption within AI, you can think of a process of creative destruction. So there is automation, there is task replacement, and there is augmentation and task creation. And then, of course, the balance between these two dimensions of AI imply very much who are the winners and who are the losers. And we may even argue that perhaps automation is something kind of easier to implement, is something with immediate cost-cutting benefits, while augmentation requires a sort of more complicated process, some creativity, some uphill struggle, some sort of concerted effort. So we may think that probably left to their own devices, firms may lean towards one kind of use of AI rather than another. So in terms of like takeaway points for research on policy, we will learn a lot more about this today, and then I guess we can probably sort of organize our questions, our thoughts around like three main points. Probably the most important point is that AI is a tool. As with many tools, like many other technological tools, many other sort of intellectual tools, it can be used for many purposes, for good and for evil. So what really matters is really who is setting priorities. So what we do with AI is a matter of choice, and priorities is not really written in stone, is not written in the nature of technology itself. And I was reading this very interesting quote to the book by Asimoglu and Johnson, by Banerjee and Duflo. So they're writing, technology is not a destiny. Humans, with all their weaknesses, remain in the driver's seat. It is still our job to determine whether the vehicles we build are heading towards justice or down the cliff. So we really need to ensure a transparent and democratic decision-making process for pro-human, pro-worker AI. The other 2 points are really about winners and losers. So who is reaping the benefits of AI? As I said before, this depends on pre-existing market power and institutions. So we need to make sure that there is enough competition, for example, in product and service markets, so as not to entrench employer market power to some extent if we care about labor markets. But also there's going to be some losers. So the idea is one of like thinking about reskilling, thinking about compensation, the social safety net. But even before that, at the sort of root of the question, there is like, how can we sort of minimize losses or maximize gains by thinking of really like augmenting and enhancing human capabilities with AI? So we are really looking forward to the rest of the day, which is mostly dedicated to this topic. Let me now move to the second day. The second day is also about what the future holds, what's the promise about the organization of work, organizational change. And this is taking many forms. We talk a lot about hybrid work, gig work, flattened hierarchies, agile hierarchies, etc. I will zoom in on hybrid work and working from home. This is what tomorrow is going to be dedicated to. So let me just introduce very briefly some data, and then of course Steve Davis will have a lot more data to present. So this is something I borrow from one of his papers. So this chart here is showing that hybrid work is really becoming the new normal. After the shock of COVID, so pre-COVID, working from home was a fraction of about 7% of total working days. And here, this point here represents pre-COVID, but if we could extend this time series, no matter how many years backwards, it was probably exactly there, between 5 and 7%. And then, of course, this skyrocketed, as we all know, with COVID, then it came further down during the second half of 2020, 2021, but since 2023, it's completely flat. So this is for the US, this is really becoming the new normal, okay? So this is hybrid work. This is the percentage of days of paid work that are being done at home. This is for the US. So today in the US, about between 25 and 30% of working time, probably like more like 25% of working time is done at home. What about other countries? Like English-speaking countries are sort of dominating this widespread increase of working from home. This is also a piece of evidence that comes from Steve Davis' work. This evidence presented here comes from job adverts. So this work here has decoded hundreds of millions of job adverts before and after COVID, and has extracted information from these job adverts about opportunities of working from home. So this is for 5 English-speaking countries, the UK, the US, Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. So again, before COVID, there was very little going on, a little bit more perhaps in the US than in other countries, like, for example, UK and New Zealand. And then with COVID, there has this massive surge in working from home, especially in the UK, for example. The UK started relatively low and is now the country in this chart with the highest incidence of working from home opportunities, like on the labor demand side. So what are the key questions? We will see a lot of that tomorrow about questions and answers to this point. Something that is the first point that has been researched is really about productivity impacts of hybrid work. And the challenge here is, of course, finding the optimal mix in hybrid work. So we see very little of like 100% full-time working from home. So the key thing is, how do we really organize hybrid work in a way in which like teams stay together, they can work together, people can learn, and they can maximize their productivity while, of course, saving on commuting time. Again, similar questions as for technology adoption. Who is reaping the benefits? So what is the impact of hybrid work for career progression? Is there still a value attached to physical presence of work? These are questions that we are sort of grappling with at the moment. What are the impacts of hybrid work on inequality? So is there, of course, a sort of college privilege attached to hybrid work? Hybrid work is not available to all. And then one of the reasons why we have detected important increases in sort of utility and job satisfaction associated to working from home is that typically we say, okay, people hate commuting, so they like to save time on commuting, and probably helps work-life balance. So what is the overall impact of well-being? And here again is a sort of balancing act between saving on commuting cost, having flexibility, and sort of preventing isolation, still sort of maximizing social and professional interaction that are also part of our well-being. Then there is a stream of research that looks more at how cities are changing with the sort of hollowing out of office space in the center. So how are urban ecosystems being reshaped by the massive increase in hybrid working? And this affects both office space and the whole sort of synergies or interdependencies around sort of downtown office spaces in terms, for example, of transportation, catering, and other local non-tradables. And finally, again, related to AI, how about new technologies for working from home? Can we really employ AI support for pro-worker working from home? I will extend very briefly on the question about working from home and inequality. I mean, the issue of hybrid work, the question about hybrid work is occurring in the sort of topic of gender inequalities in the labor market, because it is widely recognized that women have a higher demand for shorter commutes, higher flexibility, higher constraints in work-life balance. So maybe working from home can help sort of handle those constraints. So what we did here, with 2 graduate students at the LSE, we borrow the data that were very kindly lent to us by the by this team here. So these are data on online job vacancies. So we borrowed the data on US vacancies, and we organize this millions of adverts into about 4,000 or 5,000 labor market cells defined by industry, occupation, and local area in the US. And for each labor market cell, we computed what is the change in job adverts offering the opportunity of working from home, and what is the change in the female employment share. And then we plotted this relationship here. So as you can see, there is a positive relationship between the expansion of working from home across jobs, sectors, local geographies, and the presence of women. So this relationship is actually significant. Jobs that saw a 10 percentage point increase in job adverts featuring the opportunity of working from home also saw an increase in the female employment share of nearly 4 percentage points. So this seems to be relatively good news for female employment. But then if you ask a similar question about female relative wages, if you look at women's wages relative to men's wages within those same cell, you don't find any impact of wage gains. If anything, this relationship is slightly negative, but is kind of imprecise. This is not significant. But at least there doesn't seem to be like clear reasons for optimism in the diffusion of working from home and female relative wages. This is not really causal. We don't know why this is happening, for example, here, given that we see that there is a differential presence of women in different cells. Of course, there might be selection effects. So some of this kind of negative relationship might be due to selection effects, might be due to treatment effects of working from home on prospects of promotion. So in a sense, these are kind of open questions that the labor literature is researching these days. Now, given that I have introduced the topic of gender, let me move to the third day, which is mostly about inequalities in the future of work. And again, inequalities have many dimensions. The sort of traditional dimension of skills was typically researched in many waves of technological progress. I've touched upon gender, but of course we can think about race, socioeconomic status, other less researched dimensions of inequality like neurodiversity, sexual orientation, etc. Again, I will zoom in on gender. This is kind of closer to my research interest, and this is also the topic of the third day of this conference. So let me start by introducing very briefly gender inequalities for an audience that probably knows a lot about it already. So it's probably fair to say that women's increased involvement in the economy has been one of the most significant changes of labor markets during the past century. Women have made major inroads in education, employment, leadership roles, and politics in a way that would have been unthinkable, for example, even mid-20th century. And what is kind of more interesting, I've been talking so far about increasing inequalities possibly generated by technology adoption and then, of course, globalization, etc. But against the backdrop of increasing inequalities along virtually any other dimension, like education, occupation, socioeconomic status, the narrowing of gender inequalities was even more salient in a way that was a sort of swimming upstream by women along a backdrop of increasing inequality anywhere else. But despite that, there are important sort of hurdles on the path towards gender equality in all countries around the world. What is different around the world is the kind of specific dimension of inequalities that we need to sort of understand and redress. It could be labor market inequalities, it could be inequality in the access to civil rights, access to education, access to health. What I'm going to talk about here really refers to OECD countries, kind of rich countries. And even in rich countries, women make educational choices that are less conducive to financially rewarding careers. There are still large and persistent gaps in both employment and wages. And kind of interestingly, the gender gaps in paid work are more than offset by women's disproportional involvement in unpaid work in a way that implies that women work more than men during a given day. So, for example, I was looking at data for Spain and Italy. In the average day, men have typically 1.5 extra leisure with respect to women. So that's a lot. Think about what you would do with 1.5 hours extra leisure every day. But not just in terms of leisure, the amount of work that women do is also less conducive to social status and kind of professional identity. And also women bear the whole earning penalty, most, or if not all, of the earning penalty from parenthood. And this has happened despite equalized educational opportunities in this kind of high-income countries and equal pay legislation. So the obvious question is, why have gender gaps not closed? And why, or whether, is that a problem? So perhaps we should answer these two questions in this order, because whether or not this is a problem and what can be done about it depends on what are the root causes of gender inequalities. Now, at the risk of some oversimplification, I will try to summarize current views about gender gaps into two perspectives. One is that there are essential differences between men and women. So perhaps men and women differ in some fundamental characteristics. It could be skill, preference, attitude, psychological trait. And the inequalities that we observe in the labor market are mostly a manifestation of those kind of relevant dimensions. The other view is that men and women are perhaps kind of similar in many relevant dimensions, but they face different opportunities and constraints. And those opportunities and constraints come from family responsibility. Then they might themselves be driven by social norms, stereotypes, and discrimination. And then as soon as we think about differential constraints, we really need to think that gender inequality might be a symptom of misallocation of talent. And we typically think about misallocation of female talent, but we should learn to think about misallocation of male talent as well, because there are many female-dominated professions in which men are underrepresented, and perhaps the marginal man entering these occupations could be better than the marginal woman exiting the occupation. Now, of course, this is an oversimplification, and the underlying challenge is that even observed differences in skills or traits or preferences could be endogenous to kind of root norms or stereotypes of discrimination. So again, with this caveat in mind, let's think about these two views. I mean, the first view is something that has produced a very rich experimental literature on differences between men and women, for example, in risk attitude, competitive attitude. And we can immediately think that these traits are important for labor market success. There are some meta-analyses that have established that perhaps these kind of differences in psychological traits only explain a modest proportion of observed gaps. And this is the result of a sort of survey that we ran a few years ago with a team of people at the LSE. So we sent a survey to all CPR, so like the organization running this conference, all CPR members, senior and junior, asking them what they think they've learned from the experimental literature that was researching gender differences in self-confidence. So the question was not what do you think about men and women being more or less self-confident, it's really what has this literature has established. And here, there is a very small proportion, about 7% of respondents, who say both men and women are overconfident. The very vast majority, about 78%, replies men are overconfident and women are underconfident. And then there is a small share of people saying different things. Maybe they're both underconfident, maybe they're both more or less realistic. But here basically the kind of big elephant in the room is men are overconfident and women are underconfident. And implicit in that, there is sort of a lot of cascading of education and labor market effects. Then we took this literature, this precise literature that was running experiments, and we kind of classified the results contained in this literature about gender differences in self-confidence. So most of these experiments are about university students solving kind of analytical or sort of simple math problems, and then they have a sort of objective measure of their performance, and then a subjective measure, how well did you think you do? And then in this literature, you see that the very vast majority of results indicate that both men and women are overconfident. So if anything, we are all a little bit kind of delusional. And there's only a small minority, about 15%, a certain minority of results that is in line with economists' belief. So these are like fairly established economists in the profession. You may think, okay, perhaps they didn't really know this literature because not everybody at CPR does labor and gender. So what we did, for example, we restricted, this is for everybody, but we also restricted to fields in CPR that do labor, development, or public economy. So the applied micro guys may know this literature better than others, and they look exactly the same. So there is something about this literature that percolates into economists' views in a way that is not realistic. Okay, now let me move to the sort of other view about perhaps men and women being more similar to each other on average than we thought. And this is sort of, this kind of interest is kind of motivated by this huge spike here at everybody being overconfident. And here, if you look at these confidence intervals, these are the confidence intervals around men's and women's overconfident, you can see that they vastly overlap. So we can't even say that men are significantly more overconfident than women on average. So this is something that is kind of giving some credibility to this gender similarity hypothesis, that many differences in main traits between men and women is small relative to the variation within each gender. So there is this very interesting study by a social psychology that collects data on more than 120 traits, including stuff related to academic ability, could be something about verbal ability or maths ability, psychological traits, moral reasoning, and the conclusion is that for more than 3/4 of these traits, men are a lot more similar on average to women than we thought before. If anything, if we sort of represent the distribution of traits with a normal distribution, you can see that for many traits, the two distributions for men and women would very largely overlap. So what is really salient from this figure here is the overlap between the two distributions. So perhaps we are kind of similar, than the kind of very little difference in mean that we observe here. Okay, so perhaps if we're looking at like mean differences between men and women, we're not exactly looking in the right place. This is kind of true for like the vast majority of traits, but we shouldn't discard exceptions. Of course, there's relevant exceptions, as you would imagine, in like physical strength. And this is also related to the use of violence, some manifestation of sexual behavior, not all. And while we might be tempted to say, okay, perhaps this kind of traits, the use of violence and sexual behavior, are not particularly related to your labor market success, I mean, we should think better and learn, for example, from the Me Too movement of 2018 and from some recent research on the impact of sexual violence and sexual harassment and the detrimental impacts that that has on women's, not just personal well-being, but also their labor market career. So exceptions are very important here. So talking about constraints and barriers, this is perhaps where this literature in the past 10, 15 years has generated most of the advances in knowledge. So the idea is that, again, a lot of those constraints and barriers, they boil down to having families. And once we acknowledge that these kind of constraints have disparate impacts on the careers of men and women, we really need to think about questions of allocative efficiency. So this has opened up new perspectives on gender that really go beyond the zero-sum fallacy that redressing inequality should necessarily come to the detriment of one group and to the sort of improvement of the other group. So perhaps we can think of several examples that now exist in the literature that show that really removing barriers to labor market and educational entry generates a better allocation of talent. So there is a kind of seminal paper in this literature that shows that between 20% and 40% of GDP growth in the US in the past 60 years could be explained by lower barriers to the entry of women in high earnings occupation and the entry of African American men in sort of prestigious education tracks, sort of STEM tracks or high quality universities. And of course, barriers also matter for the allocation of men's talent. So this is mostly about women and black men, but there is a lot more work on sort of barriers to the entry of women into certain male-dominated occupation. But there's also some very recent work about the efficiency gain for the entry of men into some female-dominated occupation, for example, social care, for example, education. So the constraints, as I said before, are mostly about children, and perhaps we really have to think that they're mostly mediated through gender norms and stereotypes. So this is, again, something that the very recent literature has established. The importance of gender norms is a very natural kind of answer when we see that work-family issues became largely a woman's problem despite women's economic advancement. Because, of course, if gender roles were equalized within the household, then the sort of greedy work, long-hour culture, penalties to work interruption wouldn't be any more detrimental to women's career than they are to men's career. So the idea of embodying gender norms for understanding the labor market impacts of sort of unequal gender roles in the household is simply based on the idea that deviating from appropriate behavior, what we believe to be appropriate behavior, generates this utility. And we can be sort of agnostic about where this comes from. It can come from intrinsic preferences. It can come from peer pressure. Peer pressure can be real, can be perceived, can be misperceived. But there is plenty of evidence that this kind of appropriate behavior shapes outcomes in a very wide variety of scenarios. For example, marriage choices, fertility choices, careers, politics, etc. This literature is very large. I'm going to summarize it with one figure. So one picture tells 1,000 words. So this is an advert that came out in the UK at the very beginning of COVID. So in the strictest sort of period of the lockdown. So the government was telling everybody to stay home, save lives, and protect the healthcare service. And the way we were supposed to stay home and save lives, so this is 2020, you see kind of 4 scenarios. This is a family relaxing on the sofa. This is a woman looking after a baby, holding a baby. Probably she's going to change the baby here on this board. The third scenario is a woman sitting down reading a book to a toddler and at the same time doing some sort of homeschooling for a little girl. And this is household chores, again, done by a woman. And there's also some kind of suggestion about intergenerational transmission, because there is like a teenage daughter helping the mother in household chores. So in a sense, this is, I don't know how the government came up with this idea, thinking that this was a good idea to suggest how people should stay home. But in a sense, this was UK in 2020. This to give you an idea of pervasiveness of conservative norms. Gender stereotypes are also a very closely related concept. One can think of gender norms as something that shapes our behavior, our labor supply, and stereotypes are a sort of way in which sometimes individuals, firms, even the government, can sort of make simplifying assumptions about the way in which people behave. We make simplifying sort of reasoning all the time, and some stereotypes are shaping not just our own decisions, but the decisions of people we interact with. So one important question in this area of gender stereotypes is about women's choices in education. So question is like, why are women underrepresented in STEM fields? This is important not just for their earnings, but also for the contribution of like creative sectors and overall growth. And the key debate is about, are women and men different in their innate ability, or maybe there is some like stereotyping influence of families, schools, media, society, etc. I'm going to show you the result of a paper that I've just found in Nature. It came out in Nature this month. What this paper does is a paper for France, is looking at girls and boys' maths achievements. So these are like some very simple tests at the very beginning of primary school. So in a sense, this is virtually day 1 of primary school. So this is September of grade 1. These are 4 types of schools. Red and blue represents girls and boys. As you can see, in each type of school, girls and boys are nearly identical. So there is no difference in math ability the moment girls and boys enter school. This is 4 months later. So this is January of grade 1. There is already a different coming up, especially like in, say, regular school. These are like more sort of special needs schools, if I understand correctly. There is a gap coming up. And this is kind of much larger if you look 1 year later, September of grade 2. So kids enter primary school fairly similar on average in terms of math ability, and then there is a sudden gap emerging within a few months or a year. So what's going on here? It must be key, obviously by definition, what happens in the first few months of primary school. And here is where the paper considers some sort of kind of interesting explanation. Some of that is speculation, some of that is borrowing from psychology literature. Is it perhaps
because the moment in which boys and girls enter primary education, there is some sudden labeling of what is French, what is math. There might be a different teacher, there might be a different exercise book, while before lots of educational plays kind of unstructured. So we don't really, we typically don't distinguish in a salient way between verbal ability and math ability. Something that is borrowed from the sort of psychology literature, perhaps girls are more math anxious than boys. And how do they become more math anxious? Again, there might be some intergenerational transmission from math anxious teachers. Teachers in these schools are predominantly female, and this paper here finds that female teachers' anxiety shapes girls' beliefs about their own math ability and how they then perform in math-related tasks. So maybe is there a cohesive narrative here? So this is a sector that is predominantly female. If women have some sort of math anxiety, they might be more likely to pass this down to girls than to boys. So this is where perhaps rethinking about the role of more diverse gender selection in teaching could help there. And this is related to this very nice paper on Finnish schools that looks at what happened after the 1980s when a gender quota was lifted from the education sector. The gender quota back then was supposed to ensure a minimum presence of male teachers in education. When this was lifted, the sector became more female-dominated, and apparently the kind of decentralized selection, absent the quota, wasn't able to select diverse talent in the same way in which the sort of quota implemented. So let me conclude here. Some conclusions, some research agenda. So we will learn a lot more about this in day 3. So perhaps I will not go into detail. I'll leave this here as a holding slide, and maybe I can take a few questions.